So now I'm going to tell you about our last project that we're going to be working on for this summer term. And it is a project that's going to be about infographics. And infographics are really interesting. I'm sure you've seen them a lot on different social media feeds or websites, things like that. And what they do is they sort of summarize information in a visually interesting way to really grab people's attention and get them to learn about whatever it is that the infographic is about. So we're going to talk about how you create good infographics today. So one of the main features of infographics is visually how it takes up the space and what is contained in as far as visuals go in the infographic. So some aspects of the visuals of infographics are size, proximity, relationship, direction, and color. So we're going to show examples and talk about those right now. So sometimes infographics use size to show that one thing is more important than another thing. A pie graph would be an example, a basic example of this. So obviously visual art is more important than music and theater and film combined, obviously. So, and that's what's being conveyed through this infographic because of size. I pulled off of the web of an infographic that is using sort of a pie chart format. It's also using something that we're going to talk about next, which is proximity. But let's talk about the aspect of it that is the pie chart type of size relationship. And so what's being communicated through this infographic is that all of these things are relatively important as one another. Some of the things might be a little bit more important, like social innovation is clearly one that they're highlighting because it's slightly larger than the other ones. Enterprise is also slightly larger than a few of the other ones. So they're wanting to communicate that all of these things are relatively important, but then there are a few that are maybe a little bit more important than the other, and they're communicating that through the size relationship. And so, and then maybe international is still an essential component, but not quite as important as some of these other things because it doesn't visually take up quite as much space as some of the other colors here. So then the other thing that it's using is proximity. And so it's showing you maybe skills are essential for social innovation, right? So it's putting those things next to one another and perhaps creating relationships by putting them next to each other for the viewer. So I doubt that they just kind of sprinkled these things on here. They probably thought about which things kind of relate to one another. So enterprise relating to being connected. Those things are important to one another. And so that's what they're communicating through the proximity that they're using. Proximity can also be used as showing where things overlap one another and actually are very interconnected because they become the same thing. So one of those examples, and I'm sure you've seen these before, is a Venn diagram. And so what are the spaces where culture and science are overlapping one another, right? If we were to develop this infographic further, we would probably write in some of those things. And I'm sure you've done Venn diagrams before, but you can use overlap in other ways to show maybe what principles of semiotics overlap with one another. There's certainly some overlaps in that, and ultimately you're going to be creating an infographic, and I'll talk more about that at the end. You're going to be creating an infographic about some of the semiotic concepts that you've been reading about in your textbook. Here's an example that I pulled off the web of a Venn diagram, and it's actually a Venn diagram about what makes good design. So some important information in here for you all too. So having story, having shareability, which infographics are very shareable. That's why we're talking about them in this class, because they work really well in a digital format, capturing people's attention in social media and then giving them very essential information in a visually interesting way. Design, so having good elements and principles of design. And then data, so having good information that you're putting on there. You're not giving out false information. And then it shows all the different ways that these things overlap. And in the middle, when you have a perfect a combination of all four of those things, then you get a good infographic. Here's another example of size and proximity, similar to the one that I found on the web that kind of looked like a pie diagram. So putting culture as the largest, maybe science as the second largest, and then art as the third largest, right? But art is maybe a little bit more closer to culture, pop culture, than science is, and that's what it's communicating through this infographic. And so this is an example that I found on the web that is using proximity in an interesting way. It's actually using proximity in order to show a flow of information and lumping things together. So up at the top it says a day in the life of the UPS fleet, and then it's telling you all the different components of that fleet. So how many different vehicles they have, how many different tractor trailers they have, how many different jets they use, and so then it lumps those things together up here. And then in the second column, it's kind of visually lumping it through these lines that are created, but then also the proximity of them. And so, and then this is talking about the packages themselves and how they're moving. And down at the bottom, it's talking about all the different places in the world that they go. Okay, and so it's using proximity to kind of cluster that information, because it wouldn't make sense to have like a picture of Europe up here. And so they cluster them together so that this is into kind of conceptual bubbles, right? The movement of the transport systems, the kind of movement of the packages themselves, and then where the things go. And then they have this little disclaimer at the bottom about having, and I didn't realize that they had 5 meteorologists on staff at UPS evaluating the weather to decide maybe should they fly, how long should they say this package is going to take to deliver, based on things that are out of their control, being the weather. And so that's kind of clustered down at the bottom here. This is another one that uses proximity in an interesting way, and maybe a few other attributes that we've talked about so far. The other thing that this one has, just kind of overall, is it has a really interesting color scheme using blues and yellows, and then it also has this graphic of the sky that kind of creates sort of a visual draw. So you're drawn into this particular character, so then you want to learn more about that character or what he's up to, right? So sometimes just sort of superfluous visual graphics can create interest in your infographic, just to kind of draw the viewer's attention in. And then there's some different bits of information that are kind of clustered into these different clusters here, based on what type of information that they're displaying. And there's nice use of different boxes to kind of segment off different areas of the infographic, so you know that whatever this is about is going to be similar to, like, this thing is similar to this thing to this thing, because of the box that's created here. Sometimes relationships are based on gravity and how we experience the world, so putting the things as foundational at the bottom and then putting things that are built upon those things on top. And so sometimes you'll see that used in an infographic. So another thing that infographics will do is use directional flow. So what things flow into another, and they'll usually use arrows to signify that. I'm actually going to have you do a little practice activity using post-it notes and drawing arrows onto pieces of paper, and then you can photograph it and then put it onto the class blog site. So in this one, it uses directionality from the left to the right, but when there's an arrow involved, you can really make directionality happen anytime. And then sometimes they'll use sort of like a graph where the most important thing or the main thing is at the top, and then there's kind of arrows that spread out, or lines that help spread that information out to show different components of other things. Sometimes the most important thing is in the middle, and then things kind of web out from there. So this would be an example of more of like a flowchart format. So feeling stumped, and then you can kind of follow the lines to different answers to that, and then get information on how to be an entrepreneur. Okay, so if you want to do that, this is your infographic. So the other thing that when you start to use web-based things, it's called a mind map, if you've ever done it in like K-12. So one of the possibilities for creating this infographic would be to create a mind map that's a little more advanced than you've been asked to do in the past. And this one is another example of kind of mapping out information, and it has this really lovely complex graphic that accompanies it. So there's these arrows that are pointing out different parts of this phone and what those parts of the phone are used for. And then it's kind of doing this fun thing where it's kind of personifying those concepts and having little workers do things like it's describing. So people that look like they're analyzing information sitting down at a desk here. So personifying the analysis that happens in your phone when you take a picture. The other thing that can be used really effectively in infographics is color as a relationship generator. So all the blue things are similar to one another, all the red things are similar to one another, and then things that are totally different from everything else would be a color that no other colors have. You have to be a little bit careful when using this strategy because then the color scheme can get out of hand. So you generally want to use colors that are in the same intensity family. So if you're using blues, if you're using blue and red and yellow, you want to have like a really bright blue, a really bright red, and a really bright yellow. Or you could use more of like a gray tinted version of those. So then those colors still seem like they go together, even though you're using like all the colors of the rainbow, basically. So this is an example of that. So they're using all the colors of the rainbow, but they're all very bright versions of those colors. So the colors kind of go together. If you're interested in learning more about color theory, there is a class called Color and Context that's taught in the fall, and it's really interesting thinking about the different ways that color can be used. And in that class, you can actually use whatever visual format, and digital is actually preferred. So you could do a bunch of Photoshop documents in order to show color relationships that are being generated. Let's also talk about the specifics of this infographic. So what it's doing is it is creating these visual lines through color. This is actually an infographic that is showing different logos and what emotional qualities they're hoping to get because of their use of color. So pretty interesting stuff. So friendly, optimistic, there's some kind of subheadings here as well. And then some more common examples that aren't logos for particular companies, but just like smiley face, right? So it's basically taking the idea of friendly and creating a little icon for it. So quite a clever infographic being used to show the emotional guide to logo colors. All right, so now that we've talked about the design aspect of it, we have to talk about the information part of it. So how can you figure out what parts of information are going to be the most important, and in order for it to display the proper information on the poster? So you need to distill what's important, okay? So some questions to ask yourself when you do that are going to be, who is your audience for the infographic? What do they already know and what do they need to know? What is important about the thing you are making an infographic about? And what's going to catch your audience's attention? Okay, so first we want to, obviously a lot of the things in those questions are in terms of audience, right? Are you trying to talk to kids? Are you trying to talk to college students? Are you trying to talk to business students and create an infographic about entrepreneurship, right? Sometimes people just think, oh, I'm just making it for everybody. When you're making it for everybody, then you're not really making it for any one person in particular or any one group, and it's less likely to grab your audience's attention. So you usually want to think, who realistically wants to know this information, right? And how can I speak specifically to those people? So what does your audience already know? If it's preschool students, then they don't know a lot. And so you're starting from a very basic level. We can talk about who the perceived audience is for some of the later infographics that I'll show, and that might help you to narrow that idea down. And then how are you going to, through your infographic, address their background knowledge? Okay. And then the other thing is the essence of the thing, right? What is the thing that you're trying to tell? What are you trying to tell someone about? What are the basic elements that are most important to talk about there? What story do you want to tell? Is it funny? Is it a little bit sad? Is it dark? Is it really smart? Do you want to speak more to college graduate students? Is it a story of redemption? Is there a happy ending at the end? So what does, and then you also want to think about whoever the person is that's whoever the person is that's having you create this infographic. Maybe you're just creating it because you want to show off how you're really good at making infographics. You can be your own client too. But sometimes you get, hopefully, if you do design work, you get someone to pay you to make it. So if Hope College is paying for you to tell prospective students about Hope College, there are going to be certain things that they don't want told, right? That maybe the viewer does want to know, but they don't want the viewer or the prospective student in this case to know those things. And so since they're the ones that are paying the bill, they get to decide what information is told, which you can see how that can be problematic in some senses, because then only certain information is told, which maybe leaves out the full and complete story. So here's a few examples and we'll go through some of those questions. So who is the audience for this infographic? I would say based on the graphics, it's people that have some kind of connection to web design or web developers. So maybe they're one or the other, or they're at least taking classes to become one or the other, would be the main audience for this graphic. And what's being communicated to us about this thing is the difference between them, right? So the audience probably is someone similar to you guys, in a sense that you're kind of taking a design class. You don't know a ton about, web development or web design, but you understand that it's a thing that people do. And maybe more so it would be a person who's just starting to take the web design class that we offer at Hope College over in the computer science department. Maybe that would be more of the audience for it rather than students in this particular class. But students that are starting to understand what these things are and what they do, and then can kind of laugh at the difference that's communicated between the two. So this infographic is a prime example of color. So it's using color in order to communicate to us some sort of angry vibe, right? So it's, and then it's also, in addition to color, using some kind of extreme language, like the word extreme, and also using these more overly dramatic images of extreme weather circumstances. But the first thing that you notice about it is color. Definitely the strong kind of angry red color to communicate that this is a story, not a happy story, right? This example is a prime example of movement. So it's using movement to kind of flow, and even numbers, so that you kind of benchmarks along the way so you know which way the flow is going. In order to communicate to you. This one is actually communicating to you a journey. Sometimes movement can be used to communicate the movement of an idea as opposed to the movement of a physical object, in this case, a chicken. But it's using movement to kind of draw you through the different places that a chicken goes before it ends up on your table in order for you to eat it. And then this one is a prime example of using very compelling visuals in order to capture your attention. So what's happening in this is it has this big eye that's kind of a bullseye, and it draws you in. And so then you are wondering, then what is this eye for? And so then there are some other little fun, like a little brain icon that's been created, or a little newspaper folded up. And so those are kind of visuals that aren't necessary for the information. They're just put in there to make it visually more interesting. And that will happen a lot of times in infographics. Something I want you to do on your own infographic is to create something that will be visually interesting to kind of draw your viewers in, that maybe doesn't have a high information value to it. It's just there to capture attention, okay? And so this is actually an infographic about why infographics are cool. So you can read this and learn a little bit more about infographics as well. And then the last one that I'll show is an example of simplicity. And so what this visual is doing, it kind of looks like a flower. It's using this more subdued color scheme, very simple flowing lines, and so this infographic is communicating about different things that make up nature and how much of that thing exists in the world based on the space that it takes up. So this line, there's a little space here that takes up a large area, whereas some of these lines are going to spaces that are very, very small. And so they're using size in this really elegant way to communicate this basic information about probably different species that are that make up the natural world. And this one, it's kind of hard to, it's probably about different species that make up the natural world. It's kind of hard to read, but I love the way that the simple way that it's creating a line to a larger space to show that that thing takes up more space, that there's more of those things in comparison to some of the other things that are going to a very small line. Okay, so what we're going to do now is we're going to do a little graphing as a group. So I'll walk you through the process of doing this activity, and then I'd like you to do one on your own, and then also photograph a picture of what you've done and post it onto the class blog site. So there'll be two kind of activities that I'll want you to post on the class blog site as a result of watching this PowerPoint. One is this little drawing of a concept and thinking about the audience. And then another one is going to be taking little Post-it notes and writing different ideas on those Post-it notes from the textbook, and then using arrows to kind of organize all the information that you're going to put onto your infographic. So it's kind of a sketch of what you're going to do, using Post-it notes or note cards and arrows in order to start to organize information. The note cards for that portion of it should have some sort of title and then some sort of like definition or sentence underneath it to describe what you're trying to say about that thing. And you'll want to have at least 10 to 15 note cards. In the Google Drive folder in class documents, in the 04 project folder, I will place a few past examples that students have given me from doing this arrow activity. But then this activity you'll see me do up here, and yours will look similar to mine, which is going to be very sketchy. Okay, so the first one we'll do a horse. So if we think about horses, who could our audience be if we wanted to communicate something about a horse? Okay, so maybe our audience for this is new riders, people who have never ridden a horse before but need to know a few things about them before they start riding the horse. Okay, so we have our horse here in the middle, and you can just draw really quick sketches. Okay, contained within the horse is going to be different information that we want to tell them about it. So maybe we're telling them we can tell them different parts of the horse, all right? So the audience for it is going to be new riders. And what do they need to know about? They need to know about the parts of the horse. And so then we would use arrows to point to different parts of the horse that maybe are not, Let's go with not obvious. Like, we don't need an arrow to point to the eye because that's fairly obvious because people have eyes. So maybe let's think about doing the parts of the horse that are unique to horses, okay? So we'll include the mane and the forelock and the muzzle, different names for horse parts that that other animals don't have, or less animals don't have, or maybe even just that humans don't have, right? To call out the unique aspects of a horse. All right, and so that's what we're gonna do for our infographic on a horse. So if you could select a topic based off of Hope College. So who's the audience for it? You could even think about who's commissioning it, right? Like, is it you? Is it your sorority? Is it your baseball team? Who is the one that's commissioning this infographic? You can kind of imagine in your mind who is commissioning it. Then who's the audience? And go back through the slideshow and look at the different questions that I asked and actually come up with answers for those, and maybe do some sort of drawing. It doesn't have to be good, right? You can just have some sort of sketch in there and kind of point to different things, kind of just draw up a sketch of what that infographic could look like, just to get you thinking through how to distill a piece of information down based off of the audience that you want to communicate this information to. So go ahead and do that, and then photograph what you've done and post it on the class blog site. So another activity that I'm going to have you do, and this is just a real brief one, is if you could go on and do a quick Google search for an infographic, find one that is really interesting to you visually, maybe visually and information wise, and answer the series of questions about that infographic. And so if you could also post this on the blog. So in the end, we're going to have 3 different practice activities for this final infographic. This would be one of them. This should only take you like 5 minutes. But if you could do this, post an image of the infographic that you selected within the post, and then answer this series of questions and post this onto the class blog site. So now I want to show a few student examples from infographics. So now let's talk about the actual project that you're going to be creating after you've done the 3 practice activities. So what you're going to be doing is you're going to be creating a complex and visually interesting infographic using one or more of the styles that were discussed in this presentation. Your infographic should represent all the important aspects of the Visible Signs book. You want to divide the information in an interesting way, and you want to include at least 3 main points from each of the chapters, but I do not want you to divide the information up on your infographic based on chapters, like chapter 1, chapter 2. Some of the infographics that I'll show did that, and I think that makes a very poor externally valid infographic, because other people won't be that interested. Like, we want to teach people about semiotics. We don't want to teach people about the semiotics textbook. So I'll show some examples that do that. They have some really lovely other attributes for them, but for you guys, I want you, because this is a more complex, involved project. For them, it was just more of a side project. So I would like you to create something that's divided information-wise in a more complex way, okay? So please avoid just chapter headings for this. So here is a really excellent example of an infographic that was taken and then divided into different ways. What she chose to focus on were the different individuals that were talked about in the textbook and the different theories that they developed as a result of being someone who theorized about semiotics. She used color to kind of divide the information up so that you knew different bits of information were related to the different groups of theorists. It also has some really lovely extra graphics in it that she added just to create some sort of visual interest. So she found different icons that looked similar to the people that were being represented. This is another one. This one is the one where it specifically goes into each chapter, but besides these numbers, it's really is dividing the information in an interesting way and kind of adding these different infographics. This was a group project when they did it. This group actually drew things using that capture app that I've talked about in other videos. You can download it from the App Store. It's called Adobe Capture. And they drew things into a notebook and then photographed them in order to make these kind of interesting, fun icons. So they did a really elegant job of creating their own unique icons that were displayed on this poster. The other thing that they're using in a really lovely way is hierarchy. So having some of these things be larger, dialect, official, graffiti, so that you notice those things right away, and then you can learn more about those things by reading the details about them. And then because it was a more sketch-based visual, then they decided to use a gridded piece of paper as the backdrop for all of the images, which adds this overall really lovely effect to it. So they had semiotics as the heading because that's the thing that we're talking about, so that would be important to have in there. And then there's different directional lines that are going to the different sections that are talking about a particular idea, right? So this idea of icon, index, and symbol, and then having an example of each one over here. This idea of signifier and signified is very essential. It's kind of the basics, the foundations of semiotics. Okay, and so this is the last slide of student work that I'm going to talk about. And this one probably does the best job of clustering the information in a way that is not chapter based. So this is probably the strongest example that I'm going to show you. And so they use this idea of a game board and then put different bits of information about semiotics along it, put different bits of information about semiotics along the path. And so you could kind of follow along and learn a little bit more about it. And then as you're following along, you kind of imagine yourself playing this game, which makes it kind of visually compelling and makes you want to learn a little bit more about it. So it does that in a really nice way. And so then it also has some definitions, and you can kind of look at this in more detail. But in terms of information flow, this one is the strongest, I would say, out of the class examples. These infographics were done in a shorter period of time than what a full project is requiring. So now I've moved this project to be a full project. So I'm really expecting you guys to have infographics that are even at a higher level than the student examples that are shown here in terms of clustering your information in interesting ways. A lot of them just relied on the chapters to help them cluster the information, but I would prefer you to go beyond that and think about how these things interrelate to one another and just ignore that there was chapters at all involved, right? So see if you can come up with something, and good luck on the project. And once again, if you have any questions, feel free to email me. Most likely I'll email the answers back as a mass email in case other people had that question as well. So good luck.